Imagine the seas on fire. Not with flame, with ships. Dozens of them. Dragon-prowed, iron-tipped, packed shoulder to shoulder across a narrow fjord on the southwestern coast of a land that does not yet have a name. The year is 872. The air tastes of salt and blood and pine smoke. Oars churn the gray water into white. Men grip axe handles so hard their knuckles have gone the color of bone. Shields clatter against shields in a rhythm that sounds like a heartbeat. Slow, steady, getting louder. Now imagine you are standing in one of those ships. You can hear the war cries already. A wall of sound rolling across the water from the enemy fleet. 3 kings and their jarls, their huskarls, their berserkers, hundreds of warriors drawn from every corner of western Norway, united for a single purpose: to stop one man, to stop one idea, to stop what is coming before it swallows them all. That man stands at the prow of the lead ship. His name is Harald, and he has sworn an oath so strange, so absolute, so total that it has become a legend before the battle has even begun. He swore he would not cut his hair, would not comb it, would not trim his beard, not until every king in Norway bent the knee or broke against his sword. He has been fighting for 10 years. He looks like something the sea walks on, and he's about to forge a nation. Think about that for a moment. A single battle, a single fjord, a single morning on a slate-gray water, and the course of an entire civilization changed before noon. This is what history looks like when it happens in real time. Not slow, not gradual, a hammer blow. Welcome. If you are new here, this channel
to the
is
shore!
where history
Keep
becomes
moving!
something you feel, not just something you read. We cover the moments that built the world, the battles, the decisions, the men and women who stood at the edge of something vast and did not flinch. Hit that subscribe button and come with us. Because what happened at Hafrsfjord in 872 is
Row,
one of the
you
most
dogs! Row for your
consequential
lives!
mornings in all of history. And almost nobody knows it.
Hold
Let us
my
change
hand,
that.
please.
To understand why
Take this!
Hafrsfjord matters,
It's all we have!
you have to understand what Norway was in the 9th century.
Hurry,
It was
children,
not a
onto the
country.
ship.
It was not even a
My
concept.
things!
It was a coastline. 3,000 kilometers of it, carved into fjords and islands and steep valleys where isolated communities lived and fought and died in
Harald
almost
claims
complete
victory.
independence
The
from
allies
one
are
another.
defeated.
Each valley had
Defeated,
its
so
king.
many lost.
Each headland
I
had
know.
its jarl. The sea was a highway, and on that highway, Norse warriors had spent generations raiding, trading, and colonizing half the known world. But they had never unified, never agreed, never bent to a single accord. Some people look at that map and see freedom. Harald Fairhair, or Harald Fairhair, as the Norse sources call him, looked at it and saw a problem. He was the son of Halfdan the Black, king of Vestfold, a relatively modest kingdom in southeastern Norway. When his father died, Harald inherited young. The sagas say he was only 10 years old, though that figure should be taken as poetic shorthand for very young. What is clear is that by the time he came of age, he had already begun demonstrating a quality that separates ordinary kings from world-altering ones. He was not merely ambitious. He was relentless. There is a difference. Ambition ebbs and flows. It responds to failure, to exhaustion, to the cold reality of winter logistics. Relentlessness does not. It simply continues. The trigger, according to Snorri Sturluson, the great Icelandic chronicler who compiled the Norse sagas in the 13th century, was a woman. Her name was Gyda, daughter of King Eric of Hordaland. Harald sent messengers asking for her hand. She sent them back with an answer that no one in the 9th century could have expected. She would not marry a petty king, she said. If Harald wanted her, he would have to make himself king of all Norway first. Then she would consider it. Now listen. Historians debate whether Gyda was a real person, whether this story is myth, whether it was constructed after the fact to give Harald's campaign a romantic origin. That debate is legitimate. But here's what is not in dispute. Harald embarked on a campaign of unification that lasted approximately a decade, beginning sometime in the 860s, and he did not stop until there was nothing left to conquer. Whatever the real motivation, personal glory, economic vision, the logic of power, the result was the same. He fought his way north and west and south, absorbing kingdoms one by one, sometimes through battle and sometimes through alliance, sometimes through marriage into the families of the men he defeated. And then he reached the west coast. This is where the story darkens, because the kings of western Norway, men like Kejotvi the wealthy and Sulk of Rogaland and his brother the Jarl Sot, had been watching Harald's advance for years. They had seen what happened to the kingdoms he absorbed. They had made a choice. They would not wait. They would gather every ship and every sword they could find, and they would meet him on the water, where they believed they had the advantage. And they would end this before it ended them. What they assembled at Hafrsfjord was genuinely formidable. The combined fleet of the alliance stretched across the entrance to the fjord. The inlet sits near what is today the city of Stavanger in southwestern Norway, an area of sheltered water flanked by low headlands. The allied kings had numbers. They had territory. They had warriors who had spent their entire lives on these waters. And they had what every defensive coalition believes it has until the moment it does not, the advantage of fighting for home ground. Harald arrived with his own fleet, already seasoned, already hardened by a decade of campaigning. His core fighters were not just soldiers. They were, in the deepest sense, his wolves, men who had followed him through winter fjords and summer raids in the long grinding attrition of unification warfare. Among them were his huskarls, household warriors, professional fighters bound to his person, trained to an edge that conscripted farmers and seasonal warriors could not match. And alongside them, the most feared element of any Norse army, the berserkers. Here's where history and mythology become difficult to separate, and where the difficulty itself tells you something important. The berserkers. The word derives either from bear shirt, meaning they fought without armor, or bear shirt, meaning they wore the hides of bears as a kind of spiritual war garment, appear in the Norse sources as men who could enter a state of battle fury so total that they felt no pain, feared no weapon, and became, in practical terms, nearly impossible to stop. Ancient chronicles describe them as foaming at the mouth before battle, shaking with uncontrollable rage, biting the edges of their shields. Snorri describes them as herald, as shock troops, the spearhead he hurled into the most desperate moments of a fight. Modern scholarship has wrestled with the berserker phenomenon for generations. Some historians point to ritual methods, mushrooms, hyperventilation, sleep deprivation, extreme psychological conditioning. Others argue the behavioral descriptions are largely mythological, the literary creation of a culture that needed a symbol for ultimate warrior fury. But here's the thing, it does not matter which interpretation is correct, because both lead to the same tactical reality. Whether the berserkers were chemically altered, psychologically conditioned, or simply the most aggressive and fearless men Harald could find and train, their effect on enemy morale was identical. They were terrifying. The mere knowledge that Harald had them in his fleet was enough to loosen the bowels of men who had never seen them and never wanted to. Fear, on a battlefield, is not a secondary phenomenon. It is a primary weapon, and at Hafrsfjord, Harald wielded every weapon he had. The battle itself, and here is where we must be honest about the limits of the historical record, is known to us primarily through skaldic poetry, particularly the Haraldskavae composed by the skald Torbjorn Hornklofi, who was present or nearly so. Skaldic poetry is not journalism. It is not even chronicle. It is a specialized, highly formal art form in which historical events are encoded in an intricate system of metaphors, kennings, that require training to decode. The sea is the whale road. Blood is the sweat of the sword. A warrior is the feeder of ravens. This makes skaldic verse extraordinarily vivid and extraordinarily opaque at the same time. What Torbjorn tells us, filtered through later prose versions in Snorri, is Heimskringla. Is this: the battle was fought on the water and along the shoreline. Harald's fleet engaged the allied kings directly. The fighting was close, brutal, ship to ship, the kind of combat where men stood on rolling deck planks and tried to push enemies off their ships while avoiding being pushed off their own. The allied kings could not hold the line. Kjavi the wealthy fled, according to the saga, in a ship with high sides, presumably a merchant vessel, which tells you something about how quickly his military situation collapsed. Sulk of Rogaland died in the fighting. His brother Sot the Jarl died with him. When the battle broke, and battles of this era break suddenly, the psychology of a shield wall or a ship line collapsing faster than anyone can plan for, it broke completely. The surviving kings and jarls fled. Some went north, into the more remote reaches of Norway. Many went further. They took their families and their ships and their portable wealth and they sailed west, into the open Atlantic, and they did not stop until they reached the islands that were then barely settled, the Faroe Islands, the Orkneys, the Shetlands, and ultimately Iceland. Think about that consequence for a moment. The diaspora of Norse aristocracy that followed Hafrsfjord was one of the primary engines of Icelandic settlement. The men who lost at Hafrsfjord, or who saw which way the wind was blowing before the battle and chose exile over submission, became the founding families of Iceland. The culture they carried with them, the oral traditions, the legal systems, the poetry, the genealogies, that is the foundation of what eventually became the Icelandic sagas. Which means that the literature that tells us about the Viking Age, including our primary source for Hafrsfjord itself, exists in part because Harald won. History is recursive that way. The defeated created the record of their own defeat. Harald, meanwhile, had what he came for. He was not yet done. No king who unifies by force is ever entirely done, because there are always embers to stamp out, always jarls who submit publicly and scheme privately, always borders that need reinforcing. He fought on for years after Hafrsfjord, consolidating, punishing resistance, drawing the new order into something permanent. And at some point, the sagas do not give us a precise date, he cut his hair and his beard. After 10 years, or thereabouts, Gita or no Gita, the oath was complete. The skalds gave him his name then, Harald Fairhair, not exactly the epithet a man who spent a decade looking like an unwashed wolf might expect. But names are not always what they seem. It was a coronation in language. And now the harder question, the one that history always eventually demands. Was what Harald built at Hafrsfjord worth it? That question does not have a clean answer. It never does when a single man reorganizes a civilization by force. The people who fled to Iceland, many of them went because they valued independence, because the idea of bowing to any king felt like a violation of something fundamental about who they were. The Norse social world was built on a complex network of personal loyalties, local autonomy, the thing, the assembly, where free men argued and voted and settled disputes in the open. What Harald imposed was something different. Hierarchy, centralization, the logic of the state. For some, that was liberation from endless local warfare. For others, it was simply a larger cage. But here's what history teaches us, again and again, with brutal consistency. The world does not wait for perfect solutions. The men who hesitate because no option is clean lose to the men who act. Harald acted. He acted for a decade. And the result was a political entity. Fragile, contested, often violent, that would persist, evolve, fracture, and reform into what is today one of the most stable and prosperous nations on earth. Norway exists because of a morning on a fjord in 872. That is not a small thing. There is a monument at Hafrsfjord today. 3 great swords planted in the earth near the water, enormous, stylized, their blades driven into the rock. They were unveiled in 1983, designed by the sculptor Fritz Rode, placed there to mark 1100 years since the battle. They stand for the 3 kings who met at Hafrsfjord, Harald's fleet and his 2 primary opponents, and they stand for something harder to name. The permanence of a moment. The way a single morning can reach through 1,000 years and still be felt. When you look at those swords driven into the earth, not raised in triumph but planted, grounded, as if the battle itself is still happening somewhere beneath your feet, you understand something about how the Norse world understood time. Not as a line moving forward, but as something that accumulates. The past does not recede. It presses up through the ground. Harald Fairhair died around 830. No. Forgive the correction. Around 930. Having lived to an extraordinary age by the standards of the era, he had somewhere between 11 and 20 sons by multiple wives and concubines, because a man building a dynasty left nothing to chance. His death triggered exactly the kind of succession chaos that anyone with 11 sons and 1 throne might expect. His son Eric Bloodaxe, and that name tells you everything about his disposition, seized power first. Then Haakon the Good displaced him. Then Eric, his sons, challenged Haakon. The kingdom Harald had hammered into existence in one furious decade spent the next century being hammered apart and reassembled by the men he had left behind. And yet it persisted. The idea persisted. This is the deepest legacy of Hafrsfjord, not the specific political arrangement Harald imposed, which collapsed and reformed multiple times, but the idea that the land had a shape, that the coastline and the fjords and the people who lived in them belonged to something coherent. Once that idea entered the world, it became extraordinarily difficult to kill. Men fought over who would rule Norway. They did not seriously fight over whether Norway existed. Harald had done something more lasting than winning a battle. He had created a concept. And the warriors who fought at Hafrsfjord, on both sides, had done what soldiers have always done and rarely fully understood they were doing. They stood in a moment of enormous historical pressure, and they bore the weight of it with their bodies. Whether they won or lost, whether they stayed or fled, whether they built what became Norway or built what became Iceland, they were all part of the same enormous hinge of history swinging open. You do not always know, when you are standing on a ship in a fjord with an axe in your hand and the sound of war cries rolling toward you across gray water, that what you are doing will be remembered for 1,200 years. But it will be. Drop a comment. If you had been one of Harald's jarls at Hafrsfjord, would you have followed him? And if you had been one of the allied kings, would you have fought, or would you have taken your ships and sailed west? The swords are still in the earth at Hafrsfjord. The water is still gray. And somewhere in the cold Norwegian air, if you listen at exactly the right moment, you can almost hear the oars. Almost. Next time, we go further, deeper into the Viking world, deeper into the age of iron and salt water and men who believed that dying in battle was not an ending but a beginning. The stories are not finished. They never are. Stay with us.